Hi, Lynn. Thanks for joining me for Lead Time Chats.
Of course, pleasure to be here.
So today we're going to talk about the engineering hiring landscape, especially in a post-vaccine world. And Lynn, you're the founder of Key Values, which is an incredible company which helps engineers find new roles on teams that are aligned with their own values. So I know that you talk a lot. You talk to a lot of companies, hiring managers, engineering managers, and engineers.
All of the above.
Yeah, all of the people involved. So to start us off, what are the biggest shifts you've seen in the engineering hiring world?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some phases, obviously. So if we rewind back to like March 2020, which feels like a lifetime ago, I think there's a lot of questions about what was going to happen. And then some companies started to do major layoffs. And then that kind of picked up into April and May. And I think there's definitely some panic. I don't know if that's too dramatic, probably not, around just what like job security. I think engineers in general were nervous. Is probably the most, I mean, engineers generally were safer than some other roles, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I talked to some folks in the summer of last year that had experienced 2 layoffs in like a short number of months. And I think it was just
Wow.
difficult because a lot of companies who originally didn't think they needed to do layoffs were impacted, but their business was impacted in ways they didn't predict. And then they had to make those tough decisions later on. So there's like the first chapter of the pandemic, which was that any job felt like a blessing. And it
Yeah.
was just, I mean, truthfully, I thought Key Values might have died. Like I was like, the writing's on the wall. I like, maybe this is where it ends. And at the very least, kind of what Key Values rests on is that engineers get to be choosy, and because they get to be selective, they get to, choose a job based on value alignment rather than just needing to pay their bills. And so just the shift in like the power dynamic, I guess, and just that there were way fewer jobs than there were people looking for jobs. It was like it turned everything on its head. So
Yeah.
yeah, and then I think a good like the next chapter, I haven't really thought about how I would divide
Chapter
it up,
two.
but yeah, chapter 2 of the pandemic, I think that a lot of folks just didn't have the energy, or they just also like didn't want to change. If you had a job, you kind of just were like, I seen my friend, everyone knew at least one person who'd been laid off or like furloughed. So they were like, I'm just lucky to have what I have. And I think a lot of people were still kind of distracted with the transition because not all teams were working remote. And as we've all learned the hard way, that working remote and working from home during the pandemic are a little bit different because there's no
Right.
childcare, or like, everyone's learning the new systems.
So it's more about survival, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. And then I feel like maybe fall, enter chapter 3, maybe, things started to kind of resume. And then I would say definitely like chapter 4, which is what we're in right now, it is like full throttle back to how things were, if not even more intense. Companies are hiring like crazy. There's a lot of money being injected into the ecosystem. And obviously, if a company gets more funding, it's mostly to hire. And I think a lot of companies are trying to make up for lost time. They're like, remember those 2020 hiring goals we had that we hit pause on? Like, we have that plus our new 2021 goals. So what was the original question?
Just the biggest shifts you're seeing. You kind of described what you're seeing on the company side. What about from like engineers you're talking to? What have you been hearing from them?
On that end, yeah. So I think it's like a little bit of both. I think companies were like, to go back a little bit, just companies were asking me to like retire their pages. They're like, please stop sending candidates. We don't want, like, their teams were like, we just laid off pretty much our entire recruiting team. So we don't even have manpower to respond to folks and say, sorry, we're not hiring. So that was on that end. And then on the engineering side, yeah, candidate wise, people like I think people just wanted to hold on to, like, there's too much change happening in the world. So I think people wanted to just hang on to their jobs, and for totally reasonable reasons. And then now, yeah, I think that there's this thing that economists have kind of dubbed like this Great Resignation, where in a good, maybe the silver lining of the pandemic is that a lot of people had time to reflect and reevaluate what matters to them. Whether that's like, wow, I really feel so much more productive without having to commute, or like I really care about having like the 5 minutes between meetings to see my kids or like whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Or and I think a lot of people around like health and fitness too, just like I feel better being able to make my own lunches, like small,
Hmm.
they seem small, but it adds up. And we are, after all, creatures of habit. And after a year and a half of it, I think people want to kind of reprioritize what's important to them. And so now, actually, it's interesting talking to some engineering managers and hiring managers, just like how selective some of the candidates are. Like I just talked to someone who they're based in Colorado, but they're hiring, remote across the
Hmm.
U.S. And they like had 3 conversations in the last week with candidates that they really wanted to, extend offers to, and they were making some like, real demands. Like one said, I only want to work 4 days a week, like
Mm.
hard fast rule. And they're like, we're desperate to hire, but I'm not sure we're that desperate. like they're early stage startup, it's hard to do. And
Right.
another said that they really just didn't want to do like forced stand-ups in the morning. Like they're happy to sign, like they'll check in every day for sure, and they can like report back or anything else that's like asynchronous, but they just didn't want like
Oh.
which is a demand. um and
Send them
another
to range.
yeah, anyways, but I was just going to say it's
Yeah.
also interesting how now it's like things are definitely still moving, but yeah, companies are really desperate to hire, and I think everyone's kind of A, figuring out just how desperate, and B, just also deciding what their plans are. And actually you're the expert now in terms of like what are companies doing about the remote hiring or like remote
Yeah.
work policies, like the hybrid plans. And it's confusing, truthfully, on my end, because my job is to kind of like convey to job seekers what, at the very least, where companies are hiring. And a lot of
Hmm.
companies are still figuring it out. So um, yeah. And I was just gonna say, if we had this conversation like a few weeks ago, I feel like the answers might have been different. But who knows what? Yeah, like I think we all thought things were going to turn the corner very soon, but
Hmm.
maybe not with these new. I don't know what's going to happen. Yeah, like will there
Yeah.
be another shutdown? Well, I don't know.
Right. I was just talking to my partner about the Delta variant. I was like, if the school's shut, I need to be able to send my kids to school next year, like, period. Like, they're not staying home anymore.
Yeah, but it changes. Yeah, it just,
Yeah.
there's a lot of question marks still. So,
Yeah.
yeah, fingers crossed though.
But it sounds like, so key values pairs people's like, engineers values, and you kind of got to fit them with the company values. And it sounds like now engineers and companies are both figuring out what are the values that are actually important. It may not be like, we're product minded. Maybe more like, we value flexibility and work hours or those sorts of things that were not even really options like a year
Exactly.
and a
Like
half ago.
previously, yeah, if you joined a company that was all in office, it didn't occur to most people to ask for the remote option. I think a lot of people had
Right.
never tried it or even considered trying it, and then we were all forced to. So I converted a good number of folks. I do think also, generally speaking, engineers in particular like remote work. Um,
Mm-hmm.
One, because context switching is expensive, and most, at least, I mean, certainly for me too, having long
Yeah.
uninterrupted blocks of time to work is definitely the best way to go. And when you're in the office, it's easy to kind of like chit chat or someone taps you on the shoulder. So I think there's like,
Yeah.
once you taste it, it's hard to go back if that is your preference. Um, so, but yeah, agreed. Like, I was gonna say a year ago, more than a year ago, some people had never even considered asking for it, and now it's like a demand for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I was just gonna say, I looked something up recently, which was interesting. I looked quarter by quarter since like the beginning of 2020 at how frequently people selected the remote OK tag on key values. So key values has a preset list of 45 values and then a shorter list of company properties. These are just like true or false. And
Mm-hmm.
it's gone down. So it went from like 3% relative to all of the tags that are selected. And now it's like hovering under like 1.5%. And I think it's because, generally speaking, people look for things they don't have. And it by default was, everyone was working remote at the time. So it's
Oh.
like, it was like more of an expectation. And it'll be interesting to see how that changes over the next few months. And then flexible work arrangements has gone up. So I think it's like a strange thing where remote was the default and people weren't looking for it, but people are more mindfully thinking like, I want more flexibility generally, both with
Yeah.
time and where and, other things that come up in life to make sure you can balance those. And that's gone up. So they've kind of like reversed, if you look
Yeah.
at the
Or
graph of that.
remote is kind of, there's just a lot. Before it was kind of the exception, right? So people are like, oh,
Yeah.
remote, okay, that would be like really great. And now it's more like a lot of jobs are remote. So then they're looking for the more
Yeah. Or
value
just like,
oriented, like flexibility.
yeah, or just like more explicitly, I think, and it might, again, I'm guessing it'll change a little bit more throughout the year, but like Q1 of this year, we were still all remote by four, like we didn't have the choice. So people weren't like actively thinking about that, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's just, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things kind of play out.
Yeah. What we're seeing is like, it feels like companies, leadership, they're publishing policies or, publicizing like, oh, we're doing hybrid or whatever. And then like right now, managers are figuring out like, okay, well, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for hiring? And then engineers, candidates are also figuring out, well, what does that mean? Like if I interview at this company, what am I walking into? And there's this sort of like, I don't know, like one side kind of has to put their foot down and be like, this is what it's going to be. Is that a fit? But right now it's kind of in this like ambiguous, like
It
mushy
is.
stage.
I know, and it would be terrible if you think about it. Like if it was really important to me to only go into the office 1 day a week, and the company and I'm hiring, like the hiring manager's like, yeah, of course we can do that, but maybe like they haven't totally aligned internally yet, and then in
Right.
3 months they're like, no, everyone has to come in 4 days a week. Like I would quit. Like would I quit that job? Like so I think it's going to be, it's a
It'll be
little,
interesting.
it's a little interesting. Yeah, it's like not ideal, and it's so interesting because it's like the most basic thing when you think about hiring. Where are we hiring? Like what
Yeah.
location
Where
can
do I
our
need to
team members
go?
be? Yeah, and then yeah, and as a job seeker, just like, can I live where I currently live, or like where do I need to be? And it's not clear. So it's kind of funny in some ways. It's like more sophisticated. I think people have really had a lot of time to think about what they want personally, um,
Mhm.
and professionally, but it's also like at the same time back to the very most simple basics of where you can hire. And I'm curious how much you know on this front. It's been a little awkward on my end when a company is transitioning from, like, we had,
Mhm.
an office in San Francisco and now we're opening up remote in the US, that you have to set up, like, legally you have to establish a business in every state that you're hiring. And I don't
Right.
know if smaller startups like are aware of how much that's gonna, like, if they, I don't, it's just like there's a lot of adjusting is
Yeah,
the short of
for
it.
sure. Yeah,
But
I
it's
think
not my
it's
place to like tell people, like to warn them also. So I'm always
you're
like,
like, that's a separate thing you'd have to pay me for.
yeah, yeah. But it's it's non-trivial, especially if you have a
Yeah,
small team to like HR team, or who's gonna be in
absolutely.
charge
Yeah.
of that. But I think the whole world has to adjust on that front, just how, where you're doing business and setting up legal entities and what states and countries. I don't know. Yeah, it depends. So
Right. Yeah, I feel like your key values is going to have a lot of business in the months to come because I predict that there's kind of like what's going on now, right? What you call the Great Resignation, where people are trying to find like, hey, I want to work 1 day in an office. I don't want to do in person. I don't want to do like
stand up
stand-ups, right? Like,
period.
yeah. And so people are trying to find the company that's saying they're going to do those things, but then who knows what's actually going to happen, right? I mean, like people are adjusting all the time. So maybe a company that's saying, hey, we're remote first, but we still have these offices open. In 6 months, it's going to become pretty clear that the remote employees are kind of second class citizens and they're not, they're not getting the FaceTime. They're not getting, they're not intentionally setting up the team processes so that those people are getting the same opportunity. So then I
Right.
think there's going to be like a second reshuffling of like, what are teams actually doing and then people are trying to find like the teams that are actually doing what they're saying or maybe doing what they want, whether or not it's what they're saying they're doing.
Right, right. And I think just also I want to say, because I know there's a lot of cynicism around job searches and whatnot. Like I don't think employers are like intentionally trying to mislead
Mm-mm.
anyone. I think everyone's just really doesn't, we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
And I've seen a lot of interesting conversation about how you can like it only really works if you're all in person in the office or you're all remote. But and I've heard people have these strong takes that hybrid models just don't work because
Mhm.
it's not like you don't get the same amount of face time. You don't get some like it's hard to walk into that without really knowing what that entails.
Yeah.
Just like in terms of job opportunities or getting promotions or getting opportunities to get into cool special projects, like the person
Yeah.
that you run into accidentally or bump into during lunch tends to be the first person you think of because they're top of mind, you know. So
Right.
it'll be really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's safe to say that everyone's just trying to do the best they can with the
Mhm.
information that we have, and that's yeah.
What about for engineers who are, before they were in kind of this like survival, let me just hold on to this job that I have. Um, but now maybe their companies, announcing some policy that they're like, oh, that doesn't really work for me. And they're looking, popping their head up and looking and considering new roles. Do you have any advice for them about what the market's like right now?
Oh, I mean, I think generally it is a great time to find a new job for everyone, not just engineers. Um,
Mhm.
the the way I see, at least, sorry, and I guess this is in tech. I don't, yeah, I don't
Mhm.
want to expand that to just all employment everywhere. But I like to, what I've been relating it to is like a game of musical chairs, but with extra chairs. So it's like it is like there's a lot of options, and people are really are hiring pretty aggressively right now. So if there's, and I think for better or for worse, I mean, yeah, I'm like thinking who's listening to this. On the company side, it's worse, but for job seekers, it's great. Like there's a lot of competition in terms of comp, and so people are kind
Mhm.
of like outbidding themselves. So it's like if you want a pay raise, you can obviously ask your current employer, or you could change jobs. Like I think that's always
Mhm.
been true too. I've been advised that by many different people that the best way to get promoted or get a raise is to change jobs.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think it's a really good time, and I know it's scary. It's funny because for someone who's like a recruiter is always recruiting, so it's, I mean, it's just 100% of what they're thinking about at work all the time. But for most people, you like look for a job, you pop your head open, you get a job, and then you go heads down working on that product.
Mhm.
And you kind of lose touch over the next year or 5 years what
10 years.
that, yeah, or 10 years, what that feels like, and it can feel really
Yeah,
intimidating. But
exactly.
truthfully, I think it is a really good time just because it feels like everyone is hiring, and
Mhm.
there aren't enough people, and especially the more senior you are, it's like I feel like a broken record, but like you really get to have it's your pick of the litter, and you can be as selective and demanding as you want, and it's, I think, frustrating or disappointing or annoying, whatever it feels like on the employer side for people making
Mhm.
these demands. Like they will find jobs that they will find companies that can offer them those things. So
Yeah.
don't be afraid to ask. Yeah, it's like really funny. The two audiences is like one has to like lament with employers. I'm like, it is so hard. I'm sorry. And like it must be so frustrating. But on the other side, I'm like, yeah, like if you want it, you should ask for it. Like you should totally ask for more, make those demands, like negotiate. Yeah. So
Yeah. So you mentioned that Key Values has like 45 values and people can select and then try to find teams that match. Have you found that the values people want are like different? People are asking for different values that weren't in your original 45?
oh, that's a good question. I mean, yes and no. I was gonna say it's I get 'em I get different requests from the two sides. Um, the thing that people have always consistently asked, like pre-pandemic, during pandemic, post-pandemic, is just this mission-driven
Mhm.
value. But the reason why key values doesn't include that is because basically any value that every company would select is not helpful because it doesn't help you differentiate between teams, and that's kind of the goal. Because ultimately every company has a mission, even if that mission is to make money, like maybe that's not the
Right.
social good or the environmental good that you wanted, but technically that is the mission. So but that's I think I mean, you and I and most people listening understand what that means of like wanting a mission driven company. And I think that a lot of people want that now. And I don't know if again that was like this part of the awakening or like this moment of clarity that we all had or
Yeah.
hopefully had during the pandemic. But
Facing our own
um,
mortality and, you know.
yeah, just seeing like how much is messed up, whether it's like
Right.
Like, I mean, there's lots of, I mean, I think the pandemic put a spotlight on lots of issues, like our healthcare system, not
Yeah.
perfect, our education system, now that things are moving virtual, just like everything self-soothing wise, and automated, we need more automation if this happens again, which hopefully it won't.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of, there's more like a hyper focus on contributing to society, and that's like a very fluffy phrase, but in whatever way you
Yeah.
want to interpret that.
Hmm. What about for like engineering managers or hiring managers? So we talked about kind of the candidates looking for roles. You know, it's a great time to look. You know, you can
Right.
kind of ask for what you want and negotiate aggressively. But for the engineering managers and hiring managers, what would you suggest that they do, or what is the information they can provide that helps the right candidates find them?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, this has been like my answer for this has been consistent since the beginning of key values. And I think it's just
Mhm.
being really upfront about who and what you are and who and what you aren't. And I
Mm,
think there's this thing that happens where like engineering managers don't always love that job. It's like then it gets kicked to recruiting or their marketing teams.
mm,
And those people aren't engineers and they can't really speak on behalf of what it's like to be an engineer. So there's sometimes either like gets diluted or it just
mm,
turns into kind of like really fluffy jar, like the thing that I said that I was kind of eye rolling to myself. It's like, you know, a lot of jobs will say the same thing. Like it really is like the same across every job description. It's like
mhm.
work on something meaningful, learn a lot, and have fun doing it. It's like every job. Like, does that sound familiar? Probably, because that's what everyone says. Or like join a, you know,
Throw in a ping
high,
pong table and
yeah, like high growth, like you know,
right.
whatever, like this, just our trajectory, something like these phrases that you keep hearing, but they lose their meaning because everyone says them. So I think
Right.
it's really just about being specific and providing examples. And then the other thing is I mean, I've also been biased on this, but so I don't know if this is a natural trend, but I think people also want to know who they're working with. And maybe that's
Mhm.
part of feeling more isolated from the pandemic. Like social folks, it's been tough. Like if you're an extrovert, and you miss hanging out with friends and people and coworkers, like I think generally though, like introducing team members, whether that's on your about us page or your team's page, just like having names and faces or pictures of their team members makes it feel so much more human and personable. Because even still, like, you know, companies submit to key values and I do some research on them before I reach out. And sometimes like I go to a website and it's like there's not a single face. I have no, like,
Mhm.
it just feels like I'm applying to like this shell of it, like, or like this entity rather than like
Right.
a team of people, which is really what every company is made up of. And so I think that people are people just want the connection whether or not they're working remote or in person, and having anything that kind of points in that direction is really, really helpful.
Mhm. Cool.
So
Any
yeah.
other predictions, or I don't know,
Ooh.
do you have any predictions for the next few months of what we can expect? Hot
uh,
takes.
yeah, I wish I had some, I wish I had thought of some, maybe some more controversial ones. Um, I do think that this whole like remote is the future is not quite right. And I think people forget that it really is business dependent. This is not that interesting, I just realized. But
Mhm.
I mean, I just think that the people who are really gung ho about remote, it's true to some degree, but there are a lot of businesses that like operationally heavy businesses, or
Yeah.
you like you there you can't, there's no substitute for the FaceTime and in-person collaboration. So I think we'll go we'll go back to wanting offices and just having more options. I think that's kind of what it'll come down to. And yeah, I think you are the expert on all this hybrid work. I bet we'll see
Yeah.
a lot of interesting and more creative hybrid models.
Yeah.
Um, and I have to say, out of all the companies I've talked to, it's a pretty surprising minority of people who've like really already decided and have been firm and
Mm.
concrete about their hybrid plans. Like like will rotate with teams going into the office. It's 3 days a week here. Like they like just something that's really predictable,
Mhm.
and just clear and setting expectations. But yeah, I'm curious to see what happens. And I also, I mean, this is me kind of just like floating the question out there. But I'm curious to see how people who are starting companies now, how they'll kind of morph with like the structure of that company now. I wonder if people will even like, I think before it was like default get an office.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if that'll still be the case. I actually think maybe not. I think people will try the remote thing a little longer when they first
Mhm.
start out. But
Yeah, it definitely keeps costs down. But another thing I've heard is people being like, well, there's no like Google or Salesforce that's like remote only, right? Like there's no company that was remote only and then like made it the whole way. And so like, why take that risk, right? That's
yeah,
also like something I'm hearing too. Like
yeah. I was
there's
just gonna
already
say though,
enough uncertainty as there is.
I know, right? So yeah, predictions though wise, I think that it's just going to be a really good time to hire for a while.
Yeah.
I think that if anyone's like even a little bit interested, it doesn't hurt to just browse.
Mhm.
Sometimes it helps just to know what you don't want, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. Like it's good to close doors if you're wondering, if you've always like, I've always wanted to work in X or a bigger company or in this role, or it's sometimes it's helpful to go take those extra steps to find out what that would really be like, to see if you just are still interested in it.
Mhm.
But yeah, I guess
Cool.
not no super interesting controversial hot takes.
Cool. Thank you so much, Lynn. I think this will be super helpful both for people who are looking perhaps for new jobs or considering, and then also hiring managers too, of just like, being really clear about what your values are and what distinguishes you from other teams.
Yeah, and it sounds so simple, but it's like if you just pick 5 random companies right now and look at their jobs, like you'll see like it says like San Francisco, but then you read it and it's like we are flexible, and then it's like up until the end of COVID. Like when does that even mean?
Right,
Or
right.
like
It's like, I need to uproot? I need to plan to like uproot my family in 6 months. Like that's
yeah, good
important to know, right?
would be helpful to know. Yeah, right, like a
Yeah,
little heads up.
yeah.
So I think just being clear as possible is the best thing you can do.
Cool. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Of course.